As we saw last time, Versailles was the home of the French monarchy, a place that Louis XIV had envisioned, created, and orchestrated so well. Versailles defined so much of the Ancien regime, both in terms of its artistic grandeur, its social exclusivity, and its political absolutism. But it also defines the Ancien regime in terms of overwhelming debt, intense class stratification, and conservative rigidity. The story of Versailles does not end with the death of Louis XIV in 1715, however. It is also a place closely connected to the French Revolution. This is Louis XVI, who was not Louis XIV's son or grandson or even great grandson. Instead, Louis XVI was Louis XIV's great great grandson. This is because both Louis XIV and Louis XV lived atypically long lives for the 18th century. Louis XVI became king in 1765 at the age of 20. He was a shy, bookish, rather private man who enjoyed spending time alone in the woods or working as a locksmith or as a blacksmith. He wasn't stupid, as is often portrayed. Rather, he liked working with his hands and simply had no great aspirations to be king. In fact, Louis never expected to become king because he had an older brother. When that brother unexpectedly died in 1761, however, Louis began to dread the day of his coronation. He did not want to face the pressures and the decision making that being a king involves. This is Marie Antoinette, an Austrian princess who, as you may know, had a very different personality. Whereas Louis XVI almost defined what it means to be an introvert, Marie Antoinette was often exuberant and vivacious. The two were married after intense diplomatic negotiations in 1769 when she was 14 and he was 15. In the popular imagination, Marie Antoinette epitomizes the Ancien regime almost as much as Louis XIV, for she is typically seen as a selfish, if stylish woman who cared more about her dresses, hairstyles, and lapdogs than the poor people of France. Her reputed quote, "Let them, the poor, eat cake," captures this reputation perfectly. Indeed, as one historian once noted, the Queen was seen by those who didn't actually know her as being extravagant, foolish, lustful, and even lecherous. Many historians have leveled similar criticisms against the rest of the monarchy and the aristocracy in general of the Ancien regime. To measure the validity of these reputations, I would like to explore a bit more the grounds of Versailles with you. And I think that we will find a little bit more nuance than Marie Antoinette's reputation suggests. Marie and Louis XVI had great difficulty conceiving a child, which is always an issue of great concern in a hereditary monarchy. 8 years into their marriage, they still didn't have a child, and of course, people assumed that Marie Antoinette was to blame. The issue was actually Louis', and I can share the anatomical details with you later if you're interested. But after an operation, Louis' problem was solved, and the royal couple had their first child in 1778. Unfortunately for Marie, even after she had become a mother, she never felt entirely at ease at Versailles. Members of the court didn't always treat her with the respect she thought she deserved, and over time she grew to dislike the rigid formality of the French court that Louis XIV had established. Consequently, Marie asked her husband to build her a place to escape, a retreat of her own on the Versailles grounds, which was away from the main palace. She found the social pressures of Versailles to be too high. This building, known as the Petit Trianon, was the solution, and it was here that the French queen spent much of her time. It isolated her from the rest of the court, but it made her happy. Part of her reputation for selfishness came from her decision to remove herself from the main palace so frequently. Perhaps most controversially and bizarrely, the Queen had a perfect little village constructed near the Petit Trianon. It was modeled after the villages in Normandy and was a fully operational and real, with cows to milk and a working mill to grind flour, and it was all very picturesque. And yet there is something decidedly surrealistic about it all, too. How is it that there is this perfect village when just outside of Versailles grounds there were plenty of real villages full of people who weren't making a living, who were really struggling with the day to day? In fact, it's important to remember that this whole world of Versailles was built on the backs of the vast majority of France's 20 million residents, the peasants. Serfdom had been abolished centuries before, but the average French peasant family still kept less than 50% of what they produced. Imagine that 50% of the income from a farm's wheat and wine and eggs all went to pay taxes. Taxes to the crown, taxes to the church, and taxes to the cities. Most importantly, this economic hardship didn't change during Louis XIV or Louis XV's long reigns. While other parts of Europe saw economic improvements and growth in the late 17th and early 18th century, France saw economic stagnation, deficit spending, high inflation, and a real shortage of coinage. Here is one example of how France's traditionalism played out. This is a map of France, showing the regional differences in the salt tax, the gabelle. At the center of France, shown in white, there was no tax to pay. But on all of the coastal areas which actually made this much of the salt, there were taxes imposed. And furthermore, places like Brittany and Western France paid a different rate than the people in Franche-Comté in Eastern France. This type of unfair application of the law built enormous frustration, as well as resentment and mistrust of the monarchy. Interestingly, the most important of these social tensions in 18th century France were not between the aristocracy and the peasantry. Instead, the greatest tension was between the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, the middle class. The man in silk stockings and the triangular hat who is recording a transaction in his ledger is a member of the bourgeoisie. He is probably quite wealthy and socially ambitious. The reason for his wealth was the development of a complex Atlantic trade in the 1700s that at its center had the horrors of the slave trade in the Middle Passage. The people who benefited the most from the rapidly expanding Atlantic trade were the merchants, like the one from the previous slide. In the traditional Ancien Regime society, the social pyramid was clear. There were nobles, there were the bourgeoisie, and there were the peasants. By the 1770s, however, these relationships had changed as a result in the growth in the Atlantic trade, and as a result, two important and interesting patterns had emerged. The first was that on the one hand, these merchants, the bourgeoisie, had far more wealth in France than the old traditional aristocracy did. And secondly, the French monarchy was deeply in debt, in part because of all the wars it had financed, including the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. And the monarchy was looking for new sources of revenue so that it could cut into the interest rates that it was paying. What might be the solution? How about a deal? The crown began to finance the royal debt by selling aristocratic titles and important offices to members of the bourgeoisie. This gave the middle class the social prestige they so desperately sought and infused the monarchy with a lot of money quickly. This decision helped the debt crisis for a while, but it also caused social upheaval and a reversal of the traditional hierarchy. To help distinguish this new social standing, historians call the members of the old traditional aristocracy the nobility of the sword. The new bourgeois members of the aristocracy who've been given offices are known as the nobility of the robe. And as indicated in the two pyramids, the nobility of the sword has lost its position to the nobility of the robe. As time passed, the nobility of the robe and other aspiring members of the bourgeoisie wanted to gain a political power that corresponded with their economic importance. Cartoons like this one began to appear, which showed the clergy, the first estate, the traditional nobility, the second estate, reacting in horror to the demands of the third estate, which is theoretically everyone else, but in reality is the upper bourgeoisie. What does any of this have to do with Versailles? Well, quite a lot, actually. In 1789, France is once again on the edge of complete financial collapse, with the nobility of the robe clamoring for political change. To solve the economic and personal crisis, young Louis XVI saw no option but to summon a parliamentary body which had not met in 175 years. This body was called the Estates General. The nobility of the robe saw this as the perfect opportunity to assert their demands for political rights. And so in May of 1789, the Estates General, seen here, met at Versailles with its three components: the first estate, the clergy; the second estate, the nobility of the sword; and the third estate, the bourgeoisie and the nobility of the robe. Each block sat together as one, with the first estate on the left, the second estate on the right, and the third estate in the foreground of this painting. Each of the three estates had one vote, meaning that the clergy and the nobility could always outvote the bourgeoisie. Then one day, in June, the third estate was accidentally locked out of its meeting room, and so they reassembled in a tennis court instead. And there they take the famous tennis court oath, resolving not to disperse until France has a constitution and Louis XVI has agreed to share power. This is the action that begins the French Revolution. In July, events turned to Paris, where bread prices reached their highest price in over a century. A riot broke out, and the rioters decide to raid a political prison in the heart of the city to capture weapons. The prison was a symbol of royal power in the city and was called the Bastille. The successful storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, showed how weak and ineffectual the French monarchy was, and why the people of France had to take matters into their own hands. And this is why July 14th is France's National Day. Louis XVI attempted to show his support for the revolution, appearing in public wearing a liberty cap, but he was not able to convince everyone of his sincerity and of his long-term intentions. One of the ways that this public distrust manifests itself is the actual dismantling of the Bastille prison in August and September of 1789. This is also why a large group of women marched from Paris to Versailles in October of 1789 to demand that Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette return to Paris with them. The idea was that if Louis and the royal family were in Paris, then they could be monitored more carefully. The citizens of Paris wanted to prevent return to the Ancien regime, and by separating the monarchy from Versailles, this seemingly had a greater chance of success. Once in Paris, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI felt like they were under house arrest, and they grew increasingly alarmed at the legislation that was being passed by the new National Assembly, seen here. The monarch's power was being undercut significantly. Consequently, In June of 1791, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI attempted to escape, with Louis XVI dressing up as a peasant woman. The disguise successfully got them all the way to the French border, but strangely, just as they are about to cross into Germany, they were identified as the royal couple and were captured and forcibly returned to Paris. At this point, the monarchy had never been so unpopular. On the first anniversary of the Revolution, in July of 1790, the Third Estate planted liberty trees to celebrate their accomplishment of establishing a constitutional monarchy. The professed goals of the French Revolution were égalité, liberté, fraternité, equality, liberty, and fraternity. But of course, this wasn't really equality and liberty and fraternity for everyone. Rather, it was equality, liberty, and fraternity for the members of the bourgeoisie. But as we shall see next time, there were other groups who wanted some of that égalité, liberté, and fraternité too. This will lead to the second phase of the French Revolution, a much more violent phase, as you will see.